Graniola. This is the Graniola channel, and I'd like to tell you a folk tale. Tales are simple stories that have been told and retold, passed down by word of mouth from generation to generation. They unify people. This one is called A Sack Full of Veggies.
Often when you listen to a folk tale, you'll know where it comes from. At the end of this story, I'll tell you what part of the world it started in.
There was once a small village where the days were almost always sunny, and because of this, food grew easily, and people lived slow-paced, peaceful lives. Not too much took place there by way of entertainment. Most days were pretty much like those that preceded and those that followed them. Since the village was so small, the citizens all knew each other. Every once in a while, a small man who wore a long, thick robe would wander into town. He always moved slowly, staring into the sky without talking to anyone. Sometimes he would walk about for an hour, sometimes more. No one knew where he came from, nor exactly where he went when he walked away. Because they didn't have much else to talk about, and because he had been visiting for years without talking to anyone, everyone had their own theories about him. In general terms, the villagers were pretty equally divided between those who were certain that he was a genius who strolled about, staring into space while he formulated brilliant equations in his mind, and those who insisted he perambulated aimlessly with his head as empty as the sky he looked up into. They guessed that he came from the desert because their town was surrounded by desert, and also because of the thick, long robe he wore. Now, in the desert, as you might imagine, there are not many gardens. But in this tiny village, each family had its own well-tended plot of vegetables and flowers growing. If you've done any gardening yourself, you'll know that at some moments flowers and fruits and vegetables are full of color, and at other times their leaves are curled up and brown. On one of the little man's visits, the town was enjoying a magnificent fecundity. He wandered until he came to a spot where he saw huge tomatoes as big as his head growing high up upon poles. The smell of the tomatoes made his mouth water. He opened a cloth bag that he always had swung over his shoulder and began filling it with tomatoes. As he was doing this, he saw that shiny black eggplants, speckled green zucchini, brilliant yellow peppers, and golden onions were all growing near the tomatoes. He very carefully picked the biggest of each of those vegetables and added them to his bag until it was filled to the brim. Just as he added the last vegetable that would fit into the bag, he heard footsteps behind him. Startled, he turned around and saw a very tall gentleman standing on the path. A smile lit up the face of the little man. "A very good afternoon to you," he said in a cheery tone of voice. Now, by this point in the story, both you and I know that the little man lived in the desert, and I can assure you that vegetables like the ones in his bag do not grow in any desert in this world. The extremely tall gentleman could not remember having seen the little fellow before, and after he said good afternoon, because he had no idea why the other was in his garden, he asked, "What are you doing here? How did you get into my vegetable patch?" The small man grinned brightly. "What a good question. I was carried to this place by the wind. The well-developed homeowner was puzzled by this answer, and he thought to himself that here was a lost, simple-minded soul. The small man continued, "A very strong wind that was blowing this morning was so violent that it pulled me up and carried me all the way from my tent in the desert to this place." Now the gardener had been working for the past 2 hours tidying up the mess that the wind had made earlier that day, and could imagine that it might be possible for that same wind to lift and move the tiny visitor. "You were carried all the way from the desert?" "Yes, and I'm feeling quite dizzy. Am I far away from there?" "Yes, I would say 3 or 4 miles away." The gardener was still trying to calculate the exact distance when he noticed the sack. "And the sack?" "Oh yes, well, just now I felt that the wind was picking up again, so I grabbed the sack to weigh myself down. I've been feeling very unsteady, and I don't want to be carried away again." "I see," nodded the gardener. The story made sense, and he did hear the plant leaves rustling in the wind. "And how did the vegetables, which I planted and took care of, end up in the sack?" The person in front of him answered, "When I groped onto it, I was wondering the same thing, and I honestly couldn't come up with any answer to that question." By this time, the gardener had stopped thinking about the dimensions of the desert and begun musing on the fact that the other person had not only a surprisingly small body, but probably an undersized brain. "Oh, I see," was all he said, and because he could not think of anything else to add, he bid the stranger farewell and wished him a happy journey back to his home in the desert. The gardener told and retold the story many times to the people in the village, and they told and retold it to each other, but none of them could ever decide if that tiny stranger had been a very clever trickster or an innocent fool. This is a tale that is told in Morocco.